Let me ask you something. If your government runs out of money, would you want them to sell land they don't even own to real estate developers who can't finish buildings, and then to homebuyers who can't move in? In China, the Communist Party owns everything, including all the land. Local governments lease the land from the party, and then developers lease it from the local governments. And the ordinary Chinese homebuyer pay for the privilege of holding the smallest doll in the set, the one that expires in 70 years. Welcome to China's land finance machine. It's like printing cash with a shovel. For more than 20 years, it built roads, stadiums, and an entire fantasy of prosperity. But now, the shovel has hit bedrock, and the bill, oh, the bill, is still coming with interest. Stick with me, and I'll walk you through how this land machine was engineered, how it blew up, and why the bill keeps getting bigger long after the party is over. First, how the Chinese land finance machine was built, aka monetizing dirt. I remember walking past one of those land auction centers in a Chinese city once. Developers in tailored suits, local officials grinning like blackjack dealers. Everyone knew the rules. Bid high, build fast. Contribute to the GDP report, and don't ask, pesky questions about whether there will be demand in 5 years. And here's the blueprint. Step 1, the 1990s tax reform. Beijing, the central government, kept the fattest revenue streams. Local governments got the obligations, jobs, services, infrastructure, but not enough tax base to pay for it. And the solution? Land transfer fees. The state owns all land. Local governments lease it for 40 to 70 years to developers, collecting huge upfront payments, instant cash injection. In step 2, land as collateral. Local government financing vehicles sprouted like instant noodles. They borrowed money to build everything, from ring roads to cultural parks, using future land sales as collateral. It was like taking a mortgage on next year's optimism. In step 3, inflate the GDP. Want a promotion? Build a new district. Want credit from Beijing? Raise the fiscal revenue through land auctions. Want headlines? Drop $1 billion on a showpiece bridge to nowhere and call it high quality development. Step 4, the feedback loop. Higher land prices, which leads to bigger collateral, more debt, more projects, and more growth. You look like genius. Maybe MIT should just put this in their economics textbooks. Now, why did it feel so unstoppable back then? First and foremost, the great urban migration, plus the rampant speculation. Families buying multiple units as the only investment that never loses. And then there's the easy credit and political pressure for more construction, more GDP growth, and official data that, let's just say, was self-audited, right? If economic reality is optional, momentum can look immortal. And here's what they don't tell you. When local officials jack up land auction prices, they aren't just raising fiscal revenue, they are taxing the future and sending the bill straight to the Chinese homebuyers. Developers don't eat those costs, they bake them into the apartment price. Slap on a glossy brochure and call it market value. The result? Chinese homebuyers' life savings become government's fiscal budget. Their mortgages becomes the cash cow, cash flow for some CCP officials' ribbon-cutting ceremony, Vanity Bridge, or International Cultural Park with a Starbucks that never opened. Years ago, I sat in a sales office in a third-tier city. The developer rep told me bluntly that land price went crazy that year because the city needs money. And then he smiled and showed me a floor plan with a so-called special discount that was still 30% higher than last season. Outside the window, I could see the new giant government complex, gleaming like a spaceship. And inside, those average families around me were doing math on their, iPhones, trying to convert the next 30 years of their lives into a down payment. That's not a market. That is a wealth extraction machine with houseplants. And here's how the transfer works, step by step. City hikes reserve price at the land auction. Developers overbid because if you don't buy reserve land, you don't exist next quarter. And then banks finance the plot at fantasy valuations, assuming prices will never fall. Pre-sales launch at a new benchmark, justified by, surprise, the record land price. Households pay higher down payments, longer mortgages, and thinner safety nets. Local coffers fill instantly from land fees that fueled prestige projects roll. Citizens hold the bag, when the cycle turns. Falling prices, stalled projects, negative equity. They call it land finance. I call it mortgaging the Chinese middle class. And it gets worse. That fiscal revenue turned into things you can't resell. Administrative palaces, empty cultural parks, white elephant industrial zones. Try paying your kids tuition by visiting a ghost museum. And meanwhile, officials rotated out with promotions, while families rotated into a 30-year repayment plan on assets that will never regain their sticker price. And when prices fall, the wealth transfer doesn't reverse. The city already spent the money. The developer is restructuring, and the only balance sheet still paying on time is ordinary Chinese homebuyers. And this is why the unwinding feels so brutal. It's not just an asset bubble popping. It is a decade of household savings that got siphoned into municipal vanity projects and now cannot be pulled back out. The machine privatized the risk on families and socialized the wins for government budgets and perks. When the music stops, the marble floors in the government lobby still shine. Your apartment? That's now your emergency fund and your regret, all in one concrete tiny box. And because that revenue was one-off, not recurring, the machine needed ever higher land prices to keep the lights on until, physics, demographics, and trust all said no, which takes us to the risks they swore didn't exist. First, the local government's reckless borrowing. They assumed tomorrow's land prices will cover today's loans. That's not finance, that's just blind faith. Also, the moral hazard. If everyone thinks Beijing will always bail them out, they gamble like it's house money. And we know how that ends. So, how did this land finance Ponzi scheme break? I think there are three main reasons. First, financial regulators tapped the brakes hard in 2020. Credit just suddenly tightened, and developers running on fumes suddenly found that every hill was a cliff. And then there's the collision of demand versus demographics. Marriage rates fell rapidly, births dropped, household formation shrank. You can't sell a massive supply into a shrinking population. And finally, pre-sales worked until later, stopped arriving. Unfinished shells, mortgage boycotts, and once trust dies, housing becomes a risky product. And here comes the chain reaction. Developers stop bidding, land revenue collapses, local governments roll over debt at higher costs, banks choke on property exposure, tightening credit, local services get cut, and cities resort to buy a home, win a car kind of gimmicks. This isn't a normal cycle. It's a balance sheet recession on top of a demographic time bomb. Now, why the bill keeps growing? Well, because interest compounds. Those, vanity projects need maintenance. Concrete cracks, especially if it's made in China. Bailouts today are IOUs tomorrow. Weak land sales on a blip. They are now the new normal. A property slump shrinks the tax base, forcing more borrowing, and the engine is dead. But the liabilities live on. Now, can Beijing still fix it? They can cushion the blow and force banks to roll loans, push SOEs to bid at the auctions and cut the mortgage rates. But they can't revive buyers, reverse the demographics, or rebuild the trust. You can reshuffle numbers, but you can't command people into optimism. And who ultimately pays? Ordinary Chinese home buyers with their negative equity. Developers pay too. Many are gone already. Local governments pay in terms of fiscal stress, delayed salaries, and horrible services. Banks and SOEs pay through capital gains. Taxpayers pay by being the invisible ATM. And here are the telltale signs to watch for things to get worse. Land auctions where only SOEs make the bid. Local governments rolling debt on horrible terms. Marriage and birth rates staying low. And faster policy U-turns. China's system is closed. It's not 2008. So the implosion folds inward into banks, into households. It's slower, quieter, and more suffocating. And, we can see this economy just suffocating in plain sight. A friend in a third-tier city told me that auction halls used to be like standing room only. And last month, only 3 people. One SOE bid No one smiled, and that's not a market, that's life support. Now, where does this go next? I think it's going to be a shift from a build to sell to a build to rent model. Private developers will continue to shrink, SOEs grow, and defaults will go quiet. Stimulus headlines will pop markets for a week and then gravity wins. Housing becomes a liability for millions. China didn't just build cities. It built cash flows out of rising land prices. And when prices stopped rising, the cash flows vanished. The debt didn't. And that is the unwinding. Assets deflating while liabilities just refuse to shrink.